University of Melbourne, which is a collaboration between the law school, the Faculty of Engineering and Information Technology, the medical school, the arts faculty, and the education faculty, as well as having a few other friends. And the co-directors of CADE and our manager are here at the moment somewhere, but I can't see. Oh, they're over there cheering, as well as our fabulous researchers are here as well. So we're very pleased to see so many of you. And we're also delighted to introduce and welcome our guests from Tsinghua, NUS and Hong Kong Science Technology University. It's great that we're all able to come together at this time. When we set the date for this event, we did not know that it is AI Week in Australia, but it is. It's AI Week. So we're having our conference in AI Week, which is really good. And as you will probably all know, yesterday the federal government, Tim Ayres, announced the establishment of an Institute for AI Safety, which will provide advice to the government on AI safety. So that's a great opportunity as well for this conference to be leading in its conversations about AI safety. But that's not what we're doing tonight. Tonight we're turning to, I think we're probably turning to geopolitics and the global AI regulatory landscape. So we'll start that in a minute, but before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the lands of Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and I'd also like to pay my deep respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander or First Nations people who might be here today. This building is built on the site of the Royal Melbourne Hospital, the Women's Hospital, and many people would have been born there, but it's also incumbent on me to mention that many Indigenous children were taken from their mothers at this place. This was a site of the stolen generation legacy, and I think it's important that we do remember that deep sadness here as we work to reconciliation and treaty. So thank you for coming, and thank you for sharing that memory with us. And if you need to have some quiet time at any point, you can move into the garden, and the garden out there is designed to celebrate and remember the historical birthing traditions of this place. All right, so I won't say any more other than to introduce our speaker, Simon, Professor Simon Chesterman, and then he will be followed by Professor Weizing Shen, who will make some comments on Professor Chesterman's paper, and then we'll be able to have a bit of a conversation about it. So many of us know Professor Chesterman because he comes to Melbourne quite often. Hopefully others of our guests will. And actually, while I'm talking about guests, I should also call out we have the Samoan Law Reform Commission joining us today. They're over there and they've come as well, so we're delighted to have our very near neighbours here with us. All right, so Simon Chesterman is David Marshall Professor and Vice Provost, Educational Innovation at the National University of Singapore, where he's also the founding Dean of NUS College. He's Senior Director of AI Governance at AI Singapore and Editor of the Asian Journal of International Law. Previously, he was the Dean of NUS and Co-President of the Law School's Global League up until 2023. He is the author of many books and articles on AI as well as international law. And Simon is also the author of some fiction on AI. His most recent book, Artifice, I would urge everybody to read because, and I saw a video on this online, it's becoming more and more relevant in its I guess, reflections on AI and humans at this time and place. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce Simon.
Thank you so much, Jeannie. And it's great to be back at the University of Melbourne, where I was a student last century, when this building didn't exist, and when welcomes like the acknowledgement of country that you gave were a bit unusual. It's great to see they're much more an understood part of an event today. So this is really intended to be a provocation to conversation, which Jeannie highlighted. So there will be a class participation component to today's assessment. I really do want to get some reactions from all of you and to hopefully think through with you some of the challenges in the AI space. It's a great pleasure to have Professor Shen, an old colleague from Tsinghua, other colleagues from Tsinghua, colleagues from National University of Singapore, Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Pleasure to welcome the Samoans, but also a wide range of people who are with us this evening. And really what I'm going to try and do is foreground some of the things we'll be talking about in a conference over the next couple of days, which is the subtitle, Who Wins, Who Loses, and Who Decides, or Who Gains, Who Loses, and Who Decides in the global AI landscape. And as some of us were discussing over drinks beforehand, this is already a contested area, but also a very fast-moving one. So one of the challenges in this space is, even as I'm speaking, and I was updating the slides, I think yesterday, there's still things happening, like the AI Safety Institute that's being set up right now. So the starting point of all this is there's huge potential in the AI world. And I don't want to come across as an AI pessimist. Overall, I am quite optimistic. And an example of the achievements of AI is last year's Nobel Prize for Chemistry, which went to, among others, Demis Hassabis of DeepMind at Google for doing work on protein folding that would have been impossible without AI systems. And AI does open this potential for new eras of discovery and innovation, areas like in antibiotics. We basically had hit a dead end in antibiotics before AI came along. So there's huge potential there. But some people go further and say, basically, this is going to solve all our problems, that we are going to live in a world of abundance, radical abundance, where you don't need to worry about climate change. AI will solve climate change. Indeed, Mark Andreessen has written a book literally called The Techno-Optimist Manifesto, where, among other things, he argues that technology, which raises productivity, drives wages up, not down, saying it's counterintuitive, but it's true. The problem is it's not true, and he doesn't prove it. And that's not just me. That's in the same year that Google DeepMind won the Nobel Prize. This actually comes from two economists who also won Nobel Prizes last year, Darren Amokulu and Simon Johnson, who I'll refer to later. But I'm not a complete pessimist, although there are people who worry about an AI apocalypse rising up to destroy us all. And this is a common theme through many iterations of our representation of technology. It goes back through the Matrix, through 2001. You can trace it all the way back to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and indeed even the myth of Prometheus. But I think in our modern context, Rossum's Universal Robots is a good source. A century and a bit ago, this Czech play was released because it highlighted two things, both the potential risks associated with a kind of artificial intelligence, but it also, this is the play in which the word robot was coined, in Czech, robota, and robot means either serf or slave, which highlights a different kind of problem with AI, which is not how it will treat us, but how we treat it. So as Jeannie touched on, one of the things I'll be looking at is the geopolitical context of this, because I think for many people, in particular those who are in the political domain, this uncertainty about AI, the uncertainty of what it will mean for the world, it's very easy, in some ways it's comforting to fall back on a familiar geopolitical lens. And so many people frame this through the East-West conflict. And indeed, there are those who would argue that we need to have a quote-unquote democratic AI to protect it or us from a so-called authoritarian AI. And so this is framed very much as the West versus China in particular, which I think is something we'll talk about tonight. Others look at it through a north-south dimension. And indeed, one of the really interesting tensions in the way people think about AI is that in countries like Australia, Singapore, where I'm based, we tend to think about misuse of AI. But in many parts of the world, they're much more worried about misuses of AI being left behind. And so in this context, we've had lots written about it. Just to pick on Anna Bradford, who's a great scholar and a friend who came through Singapore to launch this book, Digital Empires, basically she would argue, it's not quite so blatant in the book, that what we need to do is get the democratic countries like the East, the United States and the European Union to gang up on China in order to ensure that that AI is won, if you like, by the West. Chip war is about the supply of transistors, semiconductors, and in particular the key role that Taiwan plays. Henry Kissinger, who lived to 100, spent the last couple of years of his life writing about AI, trying to warn about the perils associated with AI. This arch realist, steeped in realpolitik. And so in this context, there's a tendency to think of it as this sort of battle between different models of AI governance. The American rights-based model, American market-based model, very much free market. In Trump's big, beautiful bill, there was actually a prohibition on state-level regulation of AI, this effort to just unleash the free market. The European Union has embraced very much a rights-based approach, trying to foreground human rights. China, until recently, I would have said, had a very national security or sovereignty-based approach, but in some ways has had some quite interesting legislation in the Chinese context on algorithmic transparency, and as I'll say later, on efforts to deal with the size and scope of technology companies. But rather than this, if you like, kind of horizontal battle between different models of regulation or the geopolitics of who's ganging up on whom, the gist of my presentation tonight is that the much bigger problem is not that horizontal one, but the vertical one of how all of these states are struggling to regulate companies that are much more powerful, better resourced, and better informed than the countries are themselves. And we saw an example of that just earlier this week with Meta's antitrust or competition law case blowing up, partly because of having much, much better lawyers on the Meta side. So the analogy I would draw is not just with technology, but looking back further, because the power of these silicon sovereigns, as I'm calling them, is hard to find parallels in modern history. These companies are so highly capitalized, our economy is so dependent on them, their cultural and political influence is so great that I went back a century and a half to the East India Company, which at the high point in the mid-19th century controlled half of global trade and had its own army. And essentially, many of these companies are now operating analogously. They don't have their own armies as such, but Elon Musk, for example, is at the heart of space travel, transportation, and telecommunication with SpaceX, Tesla, and Starlink. And so he often operates almost like a prince in that there will be delegations coming to him. The Ukraine war could be heavily influenced by his decisions about who gets access to the internet and who does not. So that's a comparison I'll come back to at the very end. Now, for someone working in the AI governance space, you would think that I shouldn't be so worried. Because this is, in many ways, the golden age of AI governance. My colleague Jungpil Han and I did a project looking at the emergence of global governance of AI governance principles, which starts in around 2016 in Western technology companies, but very quickly spreads around the world and across sectors. So there are now hundreds and hundreds of guidelines, frameworks, principles adopted around the world. I'm not sure if Samoa has one yet, but it wouldn't be alone if it did. And so there is this proliferation of discussion about AI governance. But at the same time, against that, you've got the inconsistency of words and deeds, because while there has been this conversation going on about the need to have meaningful AI governance, you've had the proliferation of ever more powerful models and the downsizing of safety and security teams. This has been exacerbated by the political dynamic we've seen in the United States with the polarization of views and the Trump administration in particular's efforts to roll back any kind of AI regulation. But I think it's true around the world that efforts to rein in AI companies are on a losing battle at the moment, at least. So what I'm going to talk about is why we have this phenomenon and what, if anything, we could do about it. So I'll start by talking about the nature of the problem, and talk a bit about the turn to industry, the shift in gravitational force from public to private in particular, why states are wary, what, if anything, the international community could do, and then maybe what happens next. So in terms of the problem, again, I'm not lying awake at night worrying about the AI monster rising up against us. Some of you science fiction buffs might recognize the Shoggoth from H.G. Lovecraft. This is an old image that was doing the rounds, so I'm not worried about AI systems rising up to kill us. I think the existential question is one that's moved from pure science fiction to something we need to pay attention to, but that's not my primary concern. I'm much more worried about humans. and what humans will do with AI. This is a reference to Chaos GPT, which was released about 6 months after ChatGPT came out. ChatGPT was launched, it'll be the 3rd anniversary this weekend. 6 months after ChatGPT was released, someone created Chaos GPT and was given a 2-word instruction: destroy humanity. It didn't work, but what I found fascinating was, I suppose in some ways, the guy who set this going, which was a kind of hoax. But in many ways, the most interesting thing was that it had access to what was then Twitter and a real-time Twitter feed in which it expressed its desires and its frustration. So it was trying to fulfill its programming instruction to destroy humanity, worked out, okay, nuclear weapons would be a good way of doing that, tried to get onto the dark web to acquire nuclear weapons, was unable to, and was expressing frustration. So far, so predictable. I mean, that's just what the machine was told to do. What I found surprising was the number of humans interacting with it, replying to its tweets, saying, don't give up, hold on to your dreams, you'll find a way. So again, my concern in all of this is not so much AI systems as what humans will do or fail to do with AI. There is a different kind of concern, which is the reliance of all of us on these large companies trained on models, which are largely outside of our control. And I like to illustrate this with a series of images created by Midjourney, which are completely synthetic. It was asked by an artist to give versions of selfies in different contexts. And if you look at this like me, you might find these images kind of beautiful, a little bit uncanny. And the uncanniness, I think, comes from the fact that what the machine is doing is taking, in accordance with its instructions, a caricature of a First Nations person, a Maasai warrior, a Japanese samurai, and overlaying it on top of a very American image of a selfie. And so what it's doing is homogenizing. And I think particularly for people who are not from the dominant culture where these models are being trained, and that's a particular issue in Southeast Asia, where Singapore is located, but I would guess even for Australia, despite the fact that it's got so much in common with the United States, that I think we need to be cautious about relying on models trained on unrepresentative data. And sorry, I realize that Kevin Spacey is still not quite rehabilitated, so Jeannie, if it's okay, I'll just get you to stand in for him. Okay, this is a very real image from 1956, Dartmouth College, the retreat at which the term AI is generally regarded to have been coined. And I use this as a reminder of 2 things about the current AI moment. The first is the irrational exuberance. These guys got funding from the Rockefeller Foundation on the basis that if they had 2 months of research, they thought they could pretty much solve AI in 1956. And they didn't. Spoiler, they didn't. And we've come up with the term AI winter to reflect the mismatch of expectations and realities in the context of AI. And there are some who are speculating either we're in a bubble or we're about to enter an AI winter. Last week, people were saying that NVIDIA's earnings meant that we weren't in a bubble, or at least not a bubble yet. The speculation about whether that might burst is going to have major economic implications around the world. But there is a real question whether the expectations, the enormous expectations of what AI can do across the whole ecosystem are going to be realized. Second reason I use this image is a reminder of complete lack of diversity. A bunch of white guys sitting planning the future of the world. The diversity of people engaged in AI research is much greater now around the world, but the problem of underlying data sets not being representative, I assume, is familiar to most people here, that the AI is not trained. Indeed, we were talking earlier about how basically the lower resource languages, if you have a smaller data set, your models will perform less effectively and often with less civility than if you're trained on a large data set. So there are various problems there about bias and so on. So for a lawyer, the regulatory problem here can be broken down into a few steps, except I always like to point out that most laws can govern most AI use cases most of the time. The problem is mainly applicability to new use cases. But I do like to break down the challenges into 3 categories, which I'll only touch on briefly. So the regulation of AI is hard because AI is fast. This isn't limited to current AI systems. It's a phenomenon of computational technology more generally, illustrated by 15 years ago, the flash crash, when the New York Stock Exchange lost $1 trillion in value in 30 minutes, gained most of it back in the next 15 minutes. No one knew why, and it was because of high-frequency trading algorithms, which in theory were subject to the same rules that would apply to you and me trading, But if I was trading with Genie, we might do a few trades a minute. These were doing tens of thousands of trades every second. The solution to this is also automation, circuit breakers, to stop things if they get out of control. But the speed can be a challenge. Autonomy is a different kind of challenge, the ability of these systems to take decisions without additional human input. So you think of the autonomous vehicle. If an autonomous vehicle crashes into someone, is the driver to blame or is the manufacturer to blame? The solution here is that the developers of autonomous vehicles have realized that the midpoint between human control and automation, complete automation, is the most dangerous. So basically, they've realized that any system where, in theory, you can hand over control to the car, but you've got to be ready to seize control, that is the most dangerous. So better off having things like lane assist or complete automation and no steering wheel. So that's also a solvable problem. Opacity, meaning the quality of being difficult to understand, this is a real challenge, and we were discussing this also earlier, that even the developers of these systems cannot fully explain how they do the things that they do, which is a real problem for governance and regulation if you want to attribute responsibility effectively. There are ways in which you can pass that as well. Sometimes we don't need to understand everything. There are various medical procedures we don't understand. Indeed, I was talking with a medical friend, a doctor, who said that we've been prescribing aspirin for a century because it's good for your heart. We don't quite know why, but it works, and we're going to keep prescribing it even though we don't know why. So I think it's a mistake to think that we need to understand everything, but at least in terms of attribution of responsibility, management of risk, if the companies that are developing these systems say, well, we don't know how it does these things, should at least give us pause. Okay, so the biggest shift in the last 15 years or so of AI research has been the move from public to private. This is epitomized in many ways by OpenAI, quote unquote OpenAI. This is a photo from 2 years ago in the brief weekend and a bit when Sam Altman was sacked as the CEO of OpenAI, when it was realized it wasn't as open as it claimed to be. And the tension there came from the fact that it was set up as a not-for-profit company, but they very quickly realized as they were building their models that they would need so much money that they had to turn for profit. And indeed, OpenAI recently has now even started saying things that Sam Altman said they would never do, like developing erotic chatbots, because that's clearly a way to make money for the vast amount of resources that they claim to need. So what's happened over the course of this period is that basically the large language models that started in academic institutions, that's the blue line, places like Stanford, this is where model research started. But as the cost of computation and as the amount of data and the expense of the talent associated with it went up, all the models basically moved to industry. And so now basically all the large language models that you hear about are developed by industry. Talent has followed. So a decade ago, AIs, this is North America, but I think it's reflected around the world, PhDs in AI were about split a decade ago between those who went to academia, those who went to industry. Now almost everyone goes to industry. They're also producing research. The for-profit companies are producing an increasing proportion of AI-related research, although more recently there's been a tendency to hold back because they worry about losing out on trade secrets in particular and using that as a means of protecting their so-called moats. One consequence of the move to industry has been speed. They can release things much more quickly. I can tell you if National University of Singapore or University of Melbourne was releasing something like ChatGPT, which in addition to answering your questions could act like a therapist, a lawyer, a romantic partner, you would have institutional review boards, ethics panels. We wouldn't be able to train on the data they were using in the first place. Industry, none of this applies. So the cool thing is we get all these toys. The downside is we aren't just beta testers for these new systems. We are laboratory rats in a grand experiment. It also shifts the priorities. The fact that there are quarterly earnings calls for these companies and that the big debate about an AI bubble right now is whether NVIDIA's chips are going to keep selling and whether OpenAI is ever going to make any money. That will shift your interests. And Stuart Russell, who I think is going to be speaking tomorrow, at least by a video link, has this idea of met needs versus unmet needs. So how is this amazing technology being deployed? And there are examples of unmet needs. So things like the protein folding that's behind AlphaFold, that Nobel Prize I mentioned earlier. There's transformative, amazing research there. But if you're a for-profit company looking to monetize AI, then the way you're going to do it is by replacing human labor or monetizing attention. And we've seen both of those happening in the AI space. The debate about AI job apocalypses are not because we're doing amazing new things, it's because companies are working out that there are easy ways to replace human labor, in particular entry-level labor, which is a real challenge for universities, which are producing graduates into an increasingly uncertain job market. So why aren't states acting? Well, states are wary quite rationally. States generally think about regulating for one of two reasons. Either to address a market failure. So if you go back to the autonomous vehicle, you could have a regime that continues to blame drivers every time a car does something wrong. But if the driver's not responsible, then it's inefficient and ineffective to blame him or her. You're better off blaming the producer. And so product liability actually emerged in the 20th century as an efficient way of dealing with loss in the marketplace. But you also regulate in support of social or other policies. The reason we prohibit discrimination is not because it's inefficient, but because it's immoral. And so for AI systems, they shouldn't be able to discriminate because we don't, as a society, like that, and we have various categories that we protect. Against that, however, there is a real wariness of regulating, and I can tell you this is a very live issue for a small jurisdiction like Singapore, because there's a risk of losing competitive advantage or constraining innovation. It's been interesting watching the Age Assurance Act debates in Australia about whether this will drive away social media companies. Doesn't seem to have yet, but the social media companies seem to be at least concerned about market share and what will happen in terms of their ability to attract those new users of the future. As I mentioned earlier, there is this sort of difference of views, the American market approach, the European rights approach, China, a kind of state sovereignty, national security approach. But there's also a real question for countries about not just how to regulate, but when. So this is a reference to the Collingridge dilemma. David Collingridge wrote a book 45 years ago, Social Control of Technology. And basically one of his arguments was that at an early stage of innovation, so this is time, at an early stage of innovation, you have high ability to control that innovation, but you don't know what the risks are. The longer you wait, the clearer the risks become, but the less leverage you have over them. And the example of that is social media, where if you were doing the age assurance debate back in 2004, when Facebook was launched, it would have been pretty easy. You could have prevented them coming into the market. You could have made it a requirement of entry. Jump forward to today, and you've got all of the concerns that have been raised by Jenny, among others, about privacy and the challenges of implementing this legislation. So I think because of the recognition that we probably should have done something earlier about social media, except that we didn't know about teenage anxiety and depression, we didn't know about Cambridge Analytica, we didn't predict the impact of the pandemic, of misinformation, disinformation in the pandemic, it's very hard now to go back and put that toothpaste back in the tube. So in this situation where you have, in theory, self-regulation, but turkeys don't vote for Thanksgiving, which is an American reference, which is timely at the moment, but not really applicable to Australia. You have self-regulation, but it's unlikely that the companies are going to hold themselves back. In theory, you need the state because states are the only entities with the regulatory hammer, the ability to impose meaningful penalties. Is there a role for international coordination at least? In theory, yes. In practice, probably not. There are various models of international collaboration and coordination. And indeed, the title of the conference that starts formally tomorrow is the International AI Cooperation and Governance Forum, about cooperation and governance. So there are various models. You have models like the International Telecommunications Union and UNESCO, which have universal membership. Although you also have models like the Global Partnership on AI and the OECD. The United States only joined the Global Partnership on AI when the Europeans basically said they would exclude China. So you have the possibility of universal membership. You have bodies like the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is the reason why we can travel around the world in airplanes, and if you've never heard of it, that's because it's doing its job. You have bodies like the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which is an interesting multi-stakeholder body, because one of the challenges in this space is how you involve the private sector. You've got the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, an effort to sort of share expertise and come up with common strategies. My own personal favorite is the idea of an entity with a grand bargain, red lines that you shouldn't cross. So the grand bargain means you share technology in exchange for not crossing a certain line and sharing information on disasters. That comparison is with the International Atomic Energy Agency, which I even went so far as to design a little logo for an international artificial intelligence agency. But basically, there is no appetite for anything like this at the international level. And I know that because there was a whole UN AI advisory body process that I played a very small role in, where we basically made the case that there was a huge deficit in global governance in this space. And it was a deficit, and it was a problem for three reasons. Firstly, just participation. Of the 7 major AI governance regimes at the international level, these are non-binding agreements, there are 7 states that are party to all of them, fully 100 that aren't party to any of them. And so there's an equity concern. That doesn't persuade everyone, fine. The second argument is perspective, that you're missing out on the concerns. That in places like Singapore is very exercised about misinformation, disinformation. Other countries are much more worried about labor market disruptions. There are a diversity of experiences of AI, opportunities and risks around the world. And so you want that global perspective. But I think the main argument is if you want any of this to be effective, you need universal buy-in. Because unless you have universal buy-in, or at least the vast majority of country buy-in, you're going to have a huge problem of any kind of implementation. And this is why sort of isolating China doesn't work unless you think you can insulate yourself from models that are developed in China and vice versa, which I don't think is realistic. But maybe we can talk about that in discussion. So what would be the solution? There was a proposal for an international scientific panel, the need for standards exchanges and policy dialogues, and some sort of shared distribution of the benefits of AI. And coming out of the AI, the Global Digital Compact last year, basically we got the scientific panel that's being recruited right now, we got policy dialogues, and the rest, question mark, in theory, support for developing country development of AI systems, but no money, and absolute rejection of an AI agency, but an office drawing on existing resources. So the tragedy of AI governance is this mismatch, that the companies have all the leverage, but very little interest in developing AI governance in a meaningful way. Civil society, users like you and me, have a lot of interest, but trivially little leverage. And again, age assurance is a good example of that. Up until now, social media companies have said, well, every parent, every family should make their own decisions, which means every family is pitting themselves against some of the richest companies on the planet, who have psychologists and technologists whose job is to weaponize or to develop attention grabbing devices and systems that will be ever harder to resist. States worry about overregulation, and coordination at the international level would be possible, but has only really ever been achieved in a crisis. And so my International Atomic Energy Agency example was only possible because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so one of the risks in the AI system, if you worry about some of these larger threats to society, to the economy, is that it will take some kind of crisis to bring about the political will to act at the international level. So what should we do? Well, the first thing is we could absolutely act, but we don't. And there's a huge mismatch between what people say and what they do. They say they care about privacy, and then they go back to sharing endless amounts of information about themselves. But privacy, maybe there is a possibility. You could mobilize people around privacy, and indeed the privacy debates have shifted. Some market actors now see privacy as being something that distinguishes themselves in the market. So that's one possibility. Transparency, every time I use generative AI, my kids nag me for killing the environment. And I think more transparency about the cost of generative AI models would be an interesting thing. But the main thing, the only thing that will really work is political action, for which there doesn't seem to be any appetite. So I mentioned Darren Acemoglu and Simon Johnson did this book about power and progress, and they go back to the 20th century, early 20th century, where one solution would be if you find these companies as too big and too powerful, you can break them up. As we found coming out of the global financial crisis, if a company is too big to fail, maybe it's just too big, period. That has not worked thus far. Interestingly, again, comparing with China, China in around 2023 did break up Alibaba into 6 constituent entities. That's the only example of technology companies really being broken up. And again, last week we saw memorably the failure to do that with Meta. There's an ongoing action against Google, various other actions that don't seem likely to achieve anything. I actually think you could go back further to the 19th century and back to that example of the East India Company I mentioned earlier, which controlled half of global trade, had its own army, and then a scandal happened, which was the Indian Rebellion. And so Britain decided it had had enough I don't generally enthuse about British colonial policies, but it's useful at this moment because they dissolved the company, transferred its territory and armies to the Crown, and made it report to the Secretary of State. And so if you believe that AI is going to be this transformative technology that will reshape the world, then maybe it should be under public rather than private hands. Nonetheless, that doesn't seem likely. This is a photo from President Bush's inauguration, and you can see in the back, you can see the director of the FBI, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and they're all behind the AI silicon sovereigns, as I'm calling them. So we just heard about Australia's contribution to the AI safety system. The AI Safety Initiative, I think, started quite positively 2 years ago in Bletchley Park. But what happened on the way is that it got shifted from a safety initiative, which it was in Bletchley and then in Korea. By the time it was in Paris in February this year, it had become AI Action and was less a safety summit and more of an industry trade fair. So I'm curious to see how the Australians navigate this space. So this is my last substantive slide, which is just a quick reminder, again, to myself, how quickly all this changes, that you should really do your slides in pencil so you can correct them halfway. And indeed, so Deloitte is a good bad example from Australia about use of generative AI. But the fact that we've got NVIDIA now leading this extraordinary proportion of the American economy, and Elon Musk literally getting paid, he's not getting a check for $1 trillion, but the most ridiculous pay package in history, going to one of these silicon sovereigns, I think is a reminder that maybe we should be a little bit more cautious about how much power we're giving to these completely unaccountable, unelected, and not always ethical people. So I'm going to end with a 25-year-old reference to a movie some of you might have seen, which is that so this is the Matrix, where you could, if you like, take the blue pill and stay in the realm that you understand. And so Jeannie kind of foregrounded this. I do have a book, which is the serious book on regulation of AI, which you can read if you're very enthusiastic. But there's also the red pill. So while writing this serious book, the reward to myself was that all the crazy stuff that I couldn't put in this respectable law book, I put in the novel, Artifice. There's a Chinese version of this, but if you're very enthusiastic and you want to learn more, there's an article on SSRN you can download. This is coming out next year in the American Journal of International Law on silicon sovereigns. But thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Professor Shen. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Both books cover to cover. I highly recommend them. And in fact, we've given them out as prizes to students who've done well in our subject. So there you go. Yes, well, depends what you think of academics. Anyway, it's my great delight to welcome Professor Weizing Shen, who's going to reflect on this wonderful talk, and he is the director of the Institute for Studies on Artificial Intelligence and the Law from Tsinghua University. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you very much. And it's my great honor and great pleasure to be here to participate in the wonderful lecture. A long time ago, I was here, and I also back to Melbourne again, so after COVID-19. Before that, we have very close collaboration with Professor Chesterman, with Tsinghua, between Tsinghua and the NUS, and also Tsinghua with University of Melbourne. And just learned, and Dean Caroline Evans became the Vice Chancellor. So I really appreciate the collaboration and friendship in the past time. So thanks for Professor Chesterman's wonderful and insightful speech. I really enjoyed your talk very much. Today you have talked about the very hot topic about AI governance. I think you didn't talk as usual. You used very solid historical and political economic dimension to understand this problem, especially a very beautiful slide, a very vivid slide, especially your subtitle, how to distribute the power, benefit, and even loss between the different stakeholders. between different countries, different international organizations, how to promote the development of AI and to meet the requirement of human concern and human demand. We all have great concern. What's the future of relationship between human and the robot? So I really strongly agree with your idea about your critique on AI or technology optimisms. I don't think AI can solve anything. So I don't worry about the robot became a human, but I'm worried human became a robot in the future. You know, in the past time when I was a high school student, I first touched the computer. I was so amazing about such kind of wonderful machine, but now we use it every day. We rely on them. And the developer of the AI and others are so smart, but we are so stupid. We use it just touch and touch. So we lost a lot of capacity to develop ourselves. Perhaps in the future we will develop a robot. We will really be a robot serf of the so-called machine. So really we need to consider this question very seriously. I really agree with about Simon's idea. So besides Simon's presentation, I would like to add 2 points to make more information to Simon and also the audience. So Simon had mentioned about the different countries, especially between European and the United States and China. So I think China, just like you mentioned, perhaps the US is like market-oriented, and the European is like right-oriented. And China is sovereignty or the security-oriented, but actually China wants to develop the third way. We want to have a very good combination between the innovation and the individual rights protection. So we have passed three very important statutes to regulate the so-called AI. Besides the cyber security law and data security law, we have also personal information protection law. And we can provide the Chinese user, not only Chinese, actually globally, the user very systematic protection on the personal information, from a right to informed consent, right to delete, to be forgotten, and right to portability of data from one platform to another. Only want to emphasize the protection of individuals' rights is very important in China. It's similar like the GDPR in Europe, but we don't want to have a very, very strict regulation on AI. It will be stopped or prevent the development for AI. So we want to introduce also like the sandbox and others, like we have classification of different risks. We couldn't use one scale to control all of scenarios. So we want to different regulations for different scenarios. So it's kind of combination between innovation and security. I think it's very crucial for us. So we will have a very clear bottom line for security, but we will also want to leave lot of space for future innovation. It's kind of just like you mentioned Alibaba, and we have a very key, several years ago, divided Alibaba group into 6 mini groups, only because we want to. It's very good best practice of anti-monopoly, antitrust. So why we want to have such kind of antitrust? It's kind of destroyed. It's not good for development for Alibaba, but we want to protect the human individual's right. It's kind of a good example for us, our practice in this field. So I think everybody, in every country, every international organization will be very crucial stakeholder for the development of future AI. We should work together, unite together, and work out the very appropriate road. And China is working hard to reach this aim. It's my reflection. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. I was frantically writing things down, but thank you for those very careful thoughts. And in fact, we're delighted because we've got another 2 days to explore these questions of competition, international law, cooperation, which I think we're all so interested in because we're here. So now I'm in the privileged position of turning